Hey everyone, I'm Chris Blakeley from Spectrum Estate Agents, and I'm joined today by Aaron Emery from Pulse PM Business Consulting. Thanks for joining us tonight, Aaron.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. So, could you just tell everyone a brief description about yourself, what you do?
Sure. So Pulse PM Business Consulting assists property management business owners and the property management teams, basically ensuring that they have compliant operations, they have the right procedures, processes and policies in place, and making sure that the client, that investor, is having a positive and profitable experience.
Yeah, fantastic. And how long have you been doing property management for?
Just over 13 years now.
Right, okay. So you know it inside out.
Yeah, some would say.
Yep, very good. Well, Aaron and I have been working together for around the last 12 months, and his knowledge has been really handy for what we're doing at Spectrum, and that's why I've decided to get him on board tonight to talk about these proposed rental reforms that are coming in. These rental reforms are proposed to come in, say, in the next 12 months, and they're still taking community responses, but they were formed from a consultation that was held in 2018. In that consultation, they actually got about 135,000 written responses. Interestingly, was 79% of those responses were from tenants and 18% were from owners, 2% from property managers and 1% other.
Correct.
So what's concerning for me is that with such a large number of tenants responding to that, is that it's going to be a very biased view when they were giving their answers as to what were the problems they were experiencing. And I think a lot of these reforms do reflect that.
Yes.
Yeah,
I would agree. I think that the government here are only focusing on a minority, and they're going to make the majority of people who are doing the right thing suffer because of that minority. So I don't think that it's very fair or a balanced view at this point in time.
Yeah. And I think when we look at the figures, I think there's about 755,000 rental properties in Queensland.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yep. So if we look at 135,000 responses in total, and that's predominantly tenants, we're not getting a big snapshot of the majority.
No. I mean, at that figure, you're only looking at 7 or 8% of the number of landlords and the number of tenants that are out there.
Yeah.
And we have to then look at that and think, even if there was another 100,000 that haven't spoken up, still the large majority are doing the right thing and living in properties that are acceptable and in good condition, and they're not having these same experiences. So I don't understand. I suppose it's a bit concerning for me that the government are pressing forward with such damaging and impactful reforms that there's just not been enough consideration given.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into one of the first reforms that they're proposing, and that's the removal of without grounds to end a tenancy. So currently, if a landlord wants to end the lease for the tenant at the end of the lease, they can issue a notice without grounds, not have to give any reason, that's 60 days notice.
Yes.
What they're proposing is to bring in that you cannot do that anymore. There's only going to be specific reasons that a landlord can end a tenancy. That being that a family member is going to move into the property, or the owner is going to move back in. They want to carry out substantial renovations or modifications to the property.
Yes.
Or if I think there's only one or two other reasons, but they're very, very hard for the landlord to prove. Even the family member moving in, you need a stat deck signed off that someone will be moving in. You can't just make it up so you can end that lease.
Yeah.
And then the renovations for the property, they're saying that they're going to want signed quotes, things like that, to show the tenant that this is legit.
Correct. And I think if you look at what the current legislation offers and the protections that are already there for both landlords and for tenants in this instance versus what's being proposed, I think it will actually be a little bit more difficult. At the moment, if an owner wanted to sell a property, they could give that tenant the notice to leave, giving them the 60 days notice, requesting vacant possession at the end of the lease. Whereas now they're proposing that the owner actually has to already have it on the market and it needs to be under contract or at unconditional status before they would actually then be able to give that notice. So in addition, the others are significant breaches there's already legislation that does protect owners there for repeated breaches, so repeated offences over a 12-month period. Once they have received 2 breaches for the same reason for that repetitive issue, on that 3rd breach, you can then go to QCAT already and request termination. So I don't know that we need to change that too much, but I do believe removing that fundamental right for the investor that they cannot ask a tenant to vacate at the end of that lease agreement would be rather detrimental. 2 of the things that I guess in terms of an impact that would have, I think we could possibly see some landlords leave the market and sell their properties. That in itself would have a big impact on housing for the people that are out there looking. There will be a shortage, whether that be short-term, long-term, it's hard to say at this point in time. It certainly won't get any better if more landlords continue to do it every year, year on year. The other thing that I think will happen, they talk at the moment about the consultation, and they got feedback that there's instances where tenants have had landlords or agents issue the notice to leave, giving that without grounds termination under a retaliatory situation. And there are, again, already laws out there.
Protections in place already for that.
Correct. And again, we're talking about the minority of circumstances that would be occurring. And so the law already exists to offer that protection. But one thing that they're saying is, some agents or owners have been found to use without grounds as a way to pressure tenants to sign new fixed-term leases. Well, again, I think for the majority, the reason that there is that big push for having fixed term here in Queensland as opposed to other states, for 2 reasons I can see. One is that there are some landlord insurance companies out there that won't provide a certain level of cover, or there would be limitations on the owner's cover if it was a periodic lease agreement. The other main reason is because the notice periods are so imbalanced under a periodic lease, where the owner still has to provide 2 months notice and the tenant only has to give 2 weeks notice.
But it's just not fair.
It's not fair. 2 weeks, as you know, Chris, in any market, whether it be a busy time of the year or a slower time of the year, 2 weeks can sometimes still not be enough to vacate the tenant, advertise the property and find a new tenant within that time frame. So we are looking at then increased vacancy, increased loss of rent and those kind of things. So that is why there is a big push to have more fixed term leases in Queensland for mostly of those 2 reasons. Yeah. If the government want that to change and they want there to be more periodic leases, then we need to look at the notice periods that they have down in our southern states in New South Wales and whatnot, where they are more about 30 days or 45 days, 90 days, those type of things,
yeah.
Which would then allow more time to market the property and find a replacement tenant.
Yeah, and I can sort of understand the government looks at, from the RTA with the bonds that are held, they've worked out that most people move on average about every 18 to 19 months. Mm-hmm. So I think they're trying to make people stay in homes longer. I get that. But there's ways in our industry as property managers where we can increase the length of stay anyway by rewarding good tenants with longer leases.
Correct.
And that in turn will be beneficial for an investor, because if that tenant decided to vacate in that longer term period, mm-hmm. the tenant's up for the break lease fees, the tenant's up for the advertising, as opposed to the cost being borne by the owner.
Absolutely. And I educate a lot of the clients that I work with that there are many benefits to having longer term leases. Ultimately, investors want tenants that will stay long term, that will look after the property, treat it like it was their own, but not having the same responsibilities with council rates and mortgage bills and even maintenance costs. And they want them to stay long term and live there comfortably and pay the rent on time. Unfortunately, I believe a lot of tenants believe that they can only have 6 or 12-month leases, because there are a lot of property managers that is just the norm. So it's been kind of drummed into them that that's the only thing that they can have. So yes, I work with a lot of agents and we always recommend doing longer term leases. It gives the owner better stability. There's longevity, there's less wear and tear on the property for tenant turnover. They're not losing income from vacancy in between the changeover. But you're right, if the tenant does decide to sign a 3-year lease and then they need to vacate under an early termination, the costs of that vacate are on that tenant because they have, been responsible for that cause to vacating.
Yeah.
So I think that should stay, and there should be more longer term leases, and we need to have a little bit of education to the industry as well as landlords and tenants that we can do a lease can be any length of time as long as both parties agree.
Yeah. Very good. On to our next point, minor modifications without permission. This one can be quite scary, I think, for landlords in that currently, if any changes wanted to be made by the tenant, it has to be in writing, it has to be all approved by the landlord. The landlord's approval has to be in writing about how it's going to happen, what happens at the end of the lease, things like that, who's responsible for those costs.
Yes.
What the government's proposing is that the tenant won't have to get approval if it's for health and safety, or if it's a thing like picture books, etc. There will be things where they do need to at least notify the property manager, and that will be to get 7 days approval from the landlord to make things more comfortable for them. So if they wanted to paint a wall or something like that. So we're starting to talk about a bit more of a major modification, in my opinion. And what's scary is that if our landlord is away, that we can't get hold of them, if we haven't got an answer in that 7 days, it's deemed granted.
Yes.
So the pressure's really on from a property management point of view that we've got to have really good lines of communication with our owner, firstly.
Correct.
But then we have to establish reasonable grounds to not approve that minor modification to the point where we actually have to get a QCAT order for that not to go through.
Yes. So then we are looking at increased costs, not only to the landlords, but in this case it would be to the tenant. Or the landlord, if they declined it, then obviously to go to that QCAT hearing and put forward their reasons or justifications as to why it shouldn't occur. I think we need to remember as well, and perhaps they will consider it, that it does need to be done by a professional. The thing that we look at the moment, there is, and the government have admitted this themselves, and QCAT understand that when we get to the end of a tenancy, the RTA have reported that a lot of bond disputes or end of tenancy disputes occur because something has changed or occurred during the tenancy. There was an agreement there that they would rectify it, and then they don't. So it's one thing for a tenant to say, yes, I'll make it better. And then 6 months, 12 months, or in this case, let's say if we do have them long term, 3 years later, then they refuse to do that. Then that cost then is borne by the property owner.
Yeah, and quite often those bonds that we hold aren't enough to cover the expense of repairing these. We're mostly, again, we're talking about the minority where these situations are going to come up, but we're going into properties that have quite a lot of work to be done. They mightn't have done a good clean, so we've had to get touch-up cleans done, or we've had to get carpets redone or something like that.
Yes.
Or they haven't paid their rent for the last few weeks, and so we've got to take that out of the bond.
Correct.
And then if we're talking about some minor modifications where these tenants haven't fixed it up, we're adding that onto it. And also the potential of the damage down the track if those modifications haven't been done properly.
Yes, exactly. I think that, I agree in some aspects about picture hooks. I agree with curtains. I think that if there's no deadlock and the tenant wants to put a deadlock on because they feel a bit safer, go ahead and do that. Provide the agent or the owner with a key so they can still access. I think they're the things that doesn't pose a massive issue. And
it's a common sense sort of scenario.
Yeah, and in my situation and yours as well, I'm sure, most landlords that I know, that I've spoken to or got feedback from, they would be okay with that, and they're currently okay with that. There might be, again, a minority that don't, but I think generally the overall view is that that's not a big issue.
Yeah.
But when you are talking about repainting a wall, I don't know about you, Chris, but I'm not that great a painter myself.
No.
And cutting in and all that kind of thing. So imagine if a tenant does it and it's not correct, and then at what level do they then have to rectify? So,
and I've never seen a wall being matched perfectly back to what it was.
Exactly.
Afterwards either. So that's the other concern.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you do have any questions while we're going on to that tonight, feel free to shoot them through. Jess is over there watching out for any questions. So feel free to type them up and we'll try and answer those for you. On to the next point, and this is one that I'm probably okay with the change that's coming in, and it's regarding domestic violence and for those victims that are suffering domestic violence in the home, allowing them a quicker process to be able to move out of that property if they're feeling unsafe. Currently, there are things in place where they can end a tenancy based on domestic violence, so this seems to be an extension on that. So currently, it's a QCAP process to get that, whereas now they're saying if they can get a letter from a health professional or a protection order, that's enough for them to say, I want to be taken off the lease. But what's scary is that once they notify us of that, is that we've got 7 days to notify any other co-tenants, potentially the aggressor in the situation. So that puts property managers at a risk of when they're dealing with someone like that, to notify that, hey, someone's just moving out of the property because of domestic violence. They're not going to want you to know what's going on in their life. So it does put you in a very awkward position.
It does.
At the end of that 7 days, the co-tenant then has 21 days to decide whether they're going to continue on the lease.
Yes.
Which then means they've got to come up with the extra portion of the bond and also be able to cover the extra part of the rent. This could be quite scary because in my experience I've seen over time people that have taken over leases start to fall behind in rent because they just can't manage that financial burden. So I think a better solution to something like this, and it was something that was put forward in the responses, was that rather than the landlord end up with that financial risk and burden, why shouldn't there be a government fund created to help these victims?
Absolutely.
To help them get into another house and things like that.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, if we look at, we do have funds available for other crisis situations. And I think a domestic violence situation is absolutely a crisis. And I do believe that that person who is in that situation needs to be able to get out as quick as possible. So I think the view here is they've looked at the average times or the average length of times to get an urgent application. They're saying it's around 3 weeks.
Yeah.
I would probably beg to differ on that. I've definitely heard, some agents that I know, they're waiting 6 or 7 or 8 weeks for urgent, and for non-urgent, you're looking at sometimes 20 weeks.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're thinking from 3 weeks, if they brought in this new legislation, that tenant could be out within 7 days. They would be able to access a portion of their bond. Again, currently under legislation, the RTRA Act does not allow for any bond to be released because the tenancy has not ended. So there would need to be a change to that legislation. And again, as you mentioned, if that co-tenant, if there is one, does decide to stay, they then need to come up with that additional bond. And we also, as a property manager, you would need to make an additional reassessment on that income affordability as to whether or not they can sustain it. If not, then my understanding is that if that is not possible, then there is only that 7-day period that the property would then become vacant.
Yeah.
So again, there's not enough notice there for the owner. The other thing I think we need to look at, if something like this was to come through, is we need to understand whether a landlord's insurance situation would cover these new laws around domestic violence and those shorter notice periods, because there is going to be a greater possibility of loss of rent and increased vacancy. Yeah. So we need to just double check that they want, they're able to do that. In whole, from the consultation, Chris, the large majority of investors and tenants, and I guess any normal human person, would want someone in that situation to not be put out and to be able to get safe as quick as possible. I just think we need to tweak some of what's going to happen to make sure that that person is safe, but also this person is not completely disadvantaged, or there is that loss there then, and whether that's going to be recoverable or not. If we are looking at 3 weeks versus 1 week, when they say the median rent is around the 370 mark, 1 week's vacancy, then you've got the reletting costs, you've got marketing costs on top of that, and if it might be vacant for 2 to 3 weeks, you're very quickly looking at a $2,000 to $2,500 loss for the investor.
Yeah, and it's just something that they may not be planning for at that time, which is quite scary.
Yep.
One of the common things that seems to come up all through this is the landlord having to apply to QCAT for an order through all of these points. And I think that's going to put a lot more pressure on QCAT. You know, as you said, our times are already getting out to 20 weeks. What's it going to look like when we have to start doing all these extra applications?
Correct. And I think I'll just add with that, there's been a lot of talk about throughout the whole consultation that they're trying to improve the quality of life for tenants and make their experience better so that they don't suffer from anxiety and they're not in those situations. But again, we need to look at what's the landlord suffering, because ultimately the landlord has much more responsibility. They need to make sure that their mortgage payments are met each month, because if they don't, then yes, that person is not going to have a roof over their head.
Right, yeah.
So, and if they've got those mortgage repayments, plus they might have their own owner-occupied property that they also have mortgage payments on, that landlord is under a lot of pressure and potentially could suffer from anxiety and stress under financial stress.
Yeah.
So we have to look at it from both sides.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to those responses that, you know, have those 79% and 18%, you know, when you start to look at it from a landlord's point of view, if we had more responses, that they might have come through in that survey.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, you know, we understand that tenancies in general are becoming more long-term. Less people are buying their own homes, and it is becoming the norm to rent for a lot longer. I think this is just an easy way for the government to not take some ownership or responsibility at the fact that they can't supply enough housing. So they are trying to make it fairer for those that need to rent longer. Well, that's okay, but ultimately these are a lot of mum and dad investors. They're doing this because they're trying to better their future with their superannuation or their long-term investment plans.
Yeah.
So we need to understand again that it has to be fair for both sides.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The next point, household pets. So
Interesting topic.
It is, and it's one that I think needs to be cleared up even more. But currently, if someone wants to have a pet at a property, it's you have to apply for it, and the landlord has to approve it. So what they're proposing is that yes, you will still have to you disclose your pet, but the owner has to establish reasonable grounds again on a reason to not allow that pet.
Yes.
So I think it is good because it will force people to come forward and talk about the animals that they're going to bring in. We won't find that they have hidden that when we're doing our routine inspections. But they're talking about the establishment of a pet bond to cover, you know, things like carpet cleaning and pest control. So we will be allowed to have a special condition in our leases with that because of the pets, which I think is a good thing. But again, they're only talking, I think it's about 2 weeks rent to cover that pet bond. And again, when I have seen damage from a pet at properties, 2 weeks rent's just not going to cover it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic. There's a lot of debate on both sides about whether they should be allowed to have them or whether we should keep the status quo and keep the same acceptance and apply type situation that is currently in place now. As regard to a pet bond, I think that it's a good idea. I don't know what the answer is in terms of whether it should be 1 week or 2 weeks rent. I think we need to look at, again, whether that extra week or that extra 2 weeks would be unaffordable for a lot of people and put them under financial stress. But I do think that if a pet bond was available, I think a lot more landlords would be more open to allowing them because they know that the 4 week bond at the moment is already stretched already with repairs or restoring the property to its original condition and those kind of things. So they would be more open to it. But I still think ultimately we just have to remember that there are currently body corporates that don't allow pets.
Yeah.
I don't know that we have, we can change that opinion. That is a law. There is body corporate legislation as well that needs to be looked at. I think it comes down to placing the right pet in the right property. So I don't know about yourself, Chris, but before starting Pulse, I was a property manager, and you know, I've had tenants apply and say it's a Chihuahua, and you go and do your first routine inspection, and it's a bull mastiff.
Yeah.
And then you have tenants that want to, you know, put a pony in a 700 square metre block.
Yeah.
Well,
on top of that, I've also been to properties where they've gone, oh, look, the dog's so friendly, nothing's going to happen, you'll be fine. And sure enough, that's the dog that does snap at you and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we start to allow these people just to have pets, it does put a property manager at risk as well.
Correct. I think what we could probably do is actually establish a national register more so of pet-friendly properties and those that aren't pet-friendly. And that might help tenants identify a lot easier, and also incorporate some onus on property managers that they need to be more transparent.
Yep.
Because there is a little bit of feedback that not all current advertisements have, whether they are or they aren't pet friendly.
Yep.
So if it did say in the ad, pets considered upon application, then there would be that transparency that tenants need, as opposed to applying, asking if they can have a pet, getting told not right now, but move in and then maybe reapply in 3 months' time, and they do that and then they get declined.
Yeah.
So we can definitely make it more transparent and make it more fairer, but I don't know that we should change it completely where the owner, again, has to defend why they don't want it. At the end of the day, yes, there are more tenants, yes, they're renting for longer, and we need to make it comfortable, but we need to never forget, and I'm a tenant, so I don't say this lightly, but we need to never forget that ultimately the landlord owns the property.
And this is right. We're going to stop taking that fundamental right for the owner to decide what they want to do with their property.
That's right. Renting, again, and I don't mean to upset anyone, I'm a tenant, so I understand that if I'm granted a privilege as a tenant to rent a property, I have to look after it. I have to pay the rent on time. I have to take care of the property, and if I do get approved with a pet, I have to be a responsible pet owner. And that means cleaning up after the animal, not allowing it to bite the skirting boards or to scratch the timber floors or to do those things
Or
that
dig
we've
its way
seen.
to China.
Or dig its way under the fence and dig 4-foot holes in the backyard. Exactly. And these are the things that property managers and landlords are experiencing. And we can't say they're not, because if they weren't, they would be okay with allowing pets.
Yeah.
So we need to look at, you know, renting is a privilege. And unfortunately, again, it's a minority, but there are a minority that are doing the wrong thing, which is upsetting and hurting landlords. And again, because there is no pet bond, the current bond is not enough to cover that pet damage.
Yeah.
And even in some circumstances, property managers or landlords are going to QCAT and they're having a hard enough time getting bond money for legitimate reasons with regards to damage that is beyond fair wear and tear.
Yeah.
So I think they're concerned that that's going to only exasperate trying to then get pet damage to be claimed as well,
Yeah.
that would get rejected.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I think, yes, have pets, but again, keep limitations around it, and ultimately if the owner says no, they say no. And if that means that the property is not suitable, the tenant needs to find another property that is suitable.
Yeah.
But that can be helped by agents and landlords, the private landlords, being more transparent up front about their position around pets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got one more point to cover off, and I've just got the wrap-up symbol from Jess, but we'll quickly go over it, and that's the minimum housing standards. Now, I think everyone has a right to have a weather-safe home. You know, they should have good ventilation and things like that. So that's what this reform's proposing to bring in, is that there's a minimum standard around lighting, kitchen, what they can cook with, things like that. But I think where this will cause an issue is that there's going to be a number of properties that do need to be brought up to scratch.
Yes.
Which means we're going to have a lot of properties leave the rental market.
Correct.
Those owners are going to try and recoup their costs through increasing their rent.
Correct.
And research shows that most tenants these days couldn't even handle a 5 to 10% increase in their rent.
That's right.
So that's going to put more financial pressure on them. I just think it's ultimately going to force a lot more people to sell or increase their rents, which we're going to end up with a lot more homeless people.
Yeah, exactly. They're saying through the consultation that this minimum housing standard requirement is just an extension to a lot of existing legislation. I definitely think that there should be minimum housing standards. Again, going back to the majority, the minority, if we look at that consultation, the government said that from the 135,000 respondents, 17% of those said that they were living in a property that was not safe and not sound. Of course, that is a fairly significant number, but in the grand scheme of things, if we're just focusing on the 135, out of those respondents, that puts the figure at about 18,000 properties. What I do believe could be a little bit more fairer in this instance is doing some more consultation with those tenants that are experiencing issues, and then again, the government getting more involved and directly targeting those owners and requesting that they fix their properties and bring them up to standard. Otherwise, yes, give them a penalty that they can't rent it out until it does meet the standard. But don't penalise the majority by then saying to them that they need to make sure that they also have these, because it's clear that the large majority are doing the right thing, the large majority of houses do stack up okay.
Yeah.
And so I think in everything that they're looking at, it just needs to be more about the minority versus the majority, and it is a minority, so why do the majority have to suffer? If going back to the pets quickly, a large percentage of people do have pets. And again, that pet bond might just help bring owners up to being more open to it, which will help house more of those people that have pets. But I just think, there's always a limit.
Yeah.
And we just need to be mindful of that, because the more expensive it is for a landlord to have an investment property, the less inclined they're going to be to keep it. There's been some feedback in the consultation that will be reduced because of tax offsets, but we also know that this same government is penalising investors with minimising those tax deductions available. I think they were the ones that were even looking at reducing down the availability. They've removed altogether where a landlord could fly to visit their property once a year, and that was claimable. That's been reduced.
Yeah.
So it's a double edge, because they're saying that they could offset it with a tax refund or reducing their tax, but there's limitations to how much you can do.
And it's still a cost up front.
Exactly.
You've still got to have the money there to be able to do these things.
That's right.
So I think we've only glossed over this tonight. 20 minutes certainly wasn't long enough to go through. So we're going to put together a bit of a fact sheet that we can email out to you. So if you want a copy of that, let us know. And if you do have any further questions, feel free to shoot them through to us on the email. So my email is chris@spectrumea.com.au. Aaron, thanks so much for coming in tonight and having a chat. It's been good to get this information out there.
That's okay. The only thing I will add is for any of those people that do want to have your say, it's not too late. The consultation process is running until the 28th of December 2019, and you can very easily have your say by sending a letter or an email through to the Premier. And you can do that by visiting the website that the REIQ have established. It's rentalreforms.com.au. There's loads of information on there for you to review first and get your understanding on what's happening, and then a direct link through to the Premier where you can voice your concerns.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. Well, thanks for coming in, and thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for that.
Thank you.